Today, we're becoming more aware of the mental health and substance abuse crisis that our nation's youth are going through. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you. I think the work you're doing is really, really important. Just for those of you that haven't already spoken with you previously, like I have, I'd love to hear, give us a recap of your work, of your passion. And I'd also absolutely love to hear how you got into this arena to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I got into the area of mental health and substance abuse counseling after working for 3 decades in the field of education at the state level in Illinois. And as I began to move away from that and retire from that, I transitioned over into working in mental health and substance abuse counseling, and went back to the University of Illinois, obtained a master's degree in substance abuse counseling, and then accepted a position at Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, which is a large psychiatric hospital that treats adolescents and adults diagnosed with mental health and substance abuse. And I worked there for over a decade, treating both teens and adults. And my passion really started to develop when I was in Illinois and I was working at a crisis center, and I saw so many people struggling with mental health and substance abuse disorders. And then when I got to Menninger Clinic, I had an opportunity to work directly with teenagers and their families, and I saw so much of the pain and so much of the struggles that they were going through. And after I retired from Menninger Clinic, I wrote this book, The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse, because I wanted parents to be able to have a resource that would help them feel less paranoid, less afraid, and more confident that if they have to deal with this issue, they felt as if they had the resources to be able to do so.
Rick, one of the first things that comes to mind, really, and I'd love to maybe start here and then branch out. How do you, I kind of have this same thing about surgeons, right? Or doctors that work in the ER. How can you possibly, like, I think well, one, it's hard for someone not in your capacity, not in your profession, to see how much people are hurting, how sad they are, and how unfulfilled they are. And to take that, and I'm getting teary, to take that and to see a child going through that is tremendously difficult. How do you cope with that? How do you be surrounded by so much pain and maintain your ability to be a beacon of hope for these people?
Well, you hit right on the answer. The answer is hope. Um, and you do see a lot of pain in these families. You don't see so much of it in the kids, uh, but you do see it in the pain in the families, and the fear that they have that their child, they may lose their child, or they often wonder, well, how did I miss the warning signs? What went wrong? What kind of a parent am I? And part of my book stresses the warning signs, because these are good parents. These were very good parents doing the best job that they could. They missed the warning signs because nobody told them what to look for. They had no idea of what to look for, what the warning signs were. So they get blindsided by this kid who they find out is using a substance, and they begin to question, well, what went wrong? What did I do wrong? How did I miss all of this? It was right before me. So that was one of the strong motivations that I had for writing the book, was to give parents the warning signs to help them feel better prepared. The other issue is, how can you deal with all of this? Well, the answer to that is hope. I've seen numerous cases where children and family have gone through this and come out on the other end being much more healthy, being much more successful. So there is a sense of hope. There's a sense of hope that there is treatment, that treatment works, and that the child and the family can get through this. I've seen success cases many, many times to know that there is a sense of hope.
Rick, do you have kids?
Yes, I do. I have one son who's in his 30s now, but yeah, so I went through the teenage years with him, and I was a single parent at the time, so I know about the struggles that these parents go through. I've seen it too many times and sat with too many families to not know that, the struggles and the pain that they go through when they're dealing with a child that's been using alcohol or drugs.
Yeah, so I have a son. He's two. My wife is pregnant with our second, and this is something I think about a lot. Not necessarily particularly about substance abuse, but I'm often thinking about you know like how am I how am I screwing up my child? Like where am I going wrong? I'm trying to be the best parent because just if I put myself in the shoes of those parents, to see your child suffering.
We do the best that we can do under the circumstances. As I was saying, these are not bad parents. These are good parents. They missed the warning signs because nobody told them what to look for. And I think that many parents just are under the perception that this can't happen to their kid. This happens to other kids. But I can tell you, Andrew, that there is no child totally protected. They are all vulnerable. It doesn't matter where you live, urban, suburban, rural area. It doesn't matter what your level of income is. It doesn't matter where you send your child to school. All children, all children are vulnerable to being caught up by alcohol or drugs. There's protective environments, but no child is totally protected.
Yeah, the risk is never zero.
The risk is never zero. That's right.
I'd love to dive into the kind of the parent aspect of the things that you saw that parents maybe were doing or weren't doing to help their child. But I'd like to first dive into the the mental and emotional state of these kids that causes them to use substances in the first place. I'd love to dive into the impetus of what causes a young child to become addicted in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. Why do some children get involved with alcohol or drugs? They may not technically be addicted because that's not a diagnosis. We don't diagnose somebody as being an addict or addicted, but they're abusing a substance, and they run on a continuum to mild to moderate to severe. So why do some kids get involved in things like alcohol and drugs? Well, there's different routes and there's different reasons. Every kid is different. Some of them get involved out of curiosity. They've heard about this drug. They want to try it, and then depending on the experience that they have, they either continue or they push away and don't use it. Others are subject to peer pressure. Their friends are using, so they want to join in. Their friends encourage them, entice them, put pressure on them. And then for some kids, most of the kids that I worked with, but not all kids, there's an underlying psychological reason why that child is using a substance. There is a mental health issue behind the substance use. It might be anxiety, it might be depression, it might be some type of trauma that happened. Perhaps they were bullied at school that the parents didn't know anything about. Perhaps it's an emerging personality disorder. But there can be a psychological reason as to why that child is using a substance to medicate that issue. For example, many of the kids that I worked with at Menninger Clinic that were using marijuana, when I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. It helps me with my anxiety. So for some kids, they may be using a substance like marijuana or alcohol or some other substance to medicate an underlying issue that is really intolerable for them. Kids are no different than adults. If we have a thought or a feeling or an emotion that is intolerable, that we can't stand, we're not going to sit there with it. We're not built that way. We're going to find some way of getting out from under it. And oftentimes that relief is found in a substance like alcohol or marijuana. And kids who are struggling with these issues often find that the alcohol or the drug is the medication that works for them.
Yeah. To my understanding, and Rick, please tell me if I'm wrong. You know, addictions can be really really dangerous because they're dopamine inducing, they're dopaminergic substances, correct? And
They are. They are. They stimulate dopamine, which is a neurochemical in the brain that gives us pleasure.
yeah, and to my understanding, the reason that a substance abuse can be so dangerous is because after long, instead of like that marijuana treating the anxiety, we actually need the marijuana just to get back to kind of like our baseline self. Like I think everyone's experienced this to some degree, whether it's chocolate or chips or exercise or whatever it may be, that people get to the point where, hey, yeah, at the first, this stimulus actually did really help me with my anxiety. But over time, I needed it just to feel normal. And that anxiety is actually amplified. And I'm still using this substance because it's brought down and messed with the way that the ebbs and flows of dopamine are supposed to work in the brain. Is that far off from how it actually plays out?
No, I think that's an accurate description because for people who are smoking marijuana, for anxiety, for example, it ultimately will have a rebound effect and make the anxiety worse. And the other issue that you brought up is that we tend to develop a tolerance to these substances, so that while we may get relief, maybe smoking marijuana once a day, eventually our system adjusts, our brain adjusts, and pretty soon once a day doesn't give us the relief we want. So now we need 2 times a day, and then we need 3, and then we need 4. Well, that's tolerance. That's just the body adapting to itself so that it is requiring more and more of the substance to give us the relief that we want.
Yeah. Now, I'm 26 years old. I'm not really that far removed, I guess, from today's kind of high school generation, right? The teenagers, right? But I do feel like, at least for me personally, Rick, like social media, like Instagram really only became a thing, I'd say probably the end of my senior year. Like this is the end of 2012, beginning of 2013. Like Snapchat had just started. Like it wasn't the absolute cultural and social norm like it is today. And so, like, one, I feel I'm really lucky. I feel like I honestly dodged a bullet there. Like, I became, really integrated into social media as I had already kind of been coming of age into adulthood, right? But I would imagine that social media plays a huge part and is probably kind of like, if we're looking at a graph, most statistics are either steadily increasing or steadily decreasing. But I would imagine that there's some type of data that suggests that the start of social media, specifically Instagram, really kind of, there's a spike in the graph. There's an inflection point. That's what I would imagine. What does the data actually suggest?
Well, that's an interesting topic, Andrew, and sometimes I come on and have a discussion about social media in teens, and I sort of talk about the research that's been done on social media, what social media platforms are teens using, which ones are the most popular, what do the experts say about the appropriate age for a child to be getting onto social media, and what tips can we give parents, and if you want to have that discussion, I'll be glad to come back and we can have that discussion. It is an important issue for parents because, as you noted, social media wasn't there 20 years ago. When most of these parents were growing up, there was no social media. And now it's sort of exploded. And the research that's coming out is pretty alarming in terms of what these sites are, which ones are popular, and particularly the impact that it's having on teenage girls and their self-image. So there's a lot to that.
Yeah. No, and the reason, and we don't have to dive in super deep there, just to more to try and understand like why. So I guess I should ask that question as well. I kind of assume, and this may be a totally incorrect assumption, but let's talk about it. I want you to correct me. I just associate, and again, this association most likely completely off base, but I just associate substance abuse, you know, with an increased anxiety, increased depression among a generation. And so I guess, that leads me to the question of what is so difficult about growing up as a teenager in today's day and age, because the argument's pretty easy to make, right, that we live in the best period known to mankind, right? Violence is an all-time low, famine all-time low, generational wealth all-time high. There's so many reasons to think we live in the best period of all time. There's no reason anyone should be sad. But when we look at it, more people are sad, more people are depressed, more people are anxious. SSRIs are prescribed at a higher rate than they ever have been. Teenagers are starting to abuse these substances because they're anxious, depressed, sad. Like, what is it about the world that we live in, Rick, that is causing this to happen? Are we not teaching people to be resilient? Or is the whole system just kind of stacked, or is the deck stacked against us?
Well, it's a different environment than what you grew up in under and what I grew up under. There are so many different things coming at teenagers these years that weren't around 15, 20 years ago. But this entire issue of mental health, teenage mental health, prior to the pandemic, for 10 years prior to the pandemic, there was already a mental health crisis among teenagers. For 10 years, there was a 40% increase in high school students that were reporting feelings of sadness, hopelessness. There was a 36% increase in teenagers seriously considering suicide. That was before the pandemic. Now the pandemic comes along, and kids are isolated. Kids are pulled away from school. They're pulled away from their friends. They're doing online learning. They're away from their social activities and their sports activities. And it took that mental health crisis and it just caused it to become even more worse. So, since the pandemic began, during the pandemic years, depression, anxiety, other mental health disorders increased. Depression and anxiety doubled among teenagers. Emergency room visits for suspected suicide rose by 50% for girls and 4% for boys. And students across all grade levels were reported feeling annoyed, anxious, angry, and many reported feeling bored and sad and lonely, and some were reporting sleep problems. So the pandemic took a mental health crisis in the teenage population that was already there and intensified it.
Only 4% for boys.
Yeah, yeah.
But 50 what's the did boys just have their video games and so they could still chat with their friends online? I mean, that's what I did, right?
That's a big difference between boys and girls.
Stark difference.
I think boys and girls are alike in many ways, but girls, I think, tend to deal with mental health issues differently than boys do. But aside from the suspected suicide thoughts, Boys and girls were both reporting many of these same emotions of depression, anxiety, fear. Many of them were afraid for their families. Many saw what their families were going through, in addition to being isolated. So I'm not surprised that during that pandemic year, when everybody was sort of isolated, that we saw a lot more stress on families. And I think the kids began to feel that stress that was in the family system as well.
It's hard not to let it affect the people around you. That's for freaking sure. So I'm curious. I mean, it's very recent. Do we have any kind of reporting as to how kids are doing? I mean, we're not really post COVID, but we're definitely back in public. We're definitely, back doing a lot of the same things, but it may be too soon. Do we have any kind of that reporting right now as to how things have returned?
I think it is too soon. Ironically, during the pandemic year, while mental health issues sort of increased, substance abuse among teenagers went down.
Access.
And it went down.
Access was
and it
just
went
down,
down.
right? They couldn't go visit their weed dealer,
Right.
or
Right.
their parents were home, so they couldn't take anything out of the medicine closet or the liquor cabinet.
So it declined significantly, and across all drugs, whether it's alcohol or marijuana or vaping. And vaping, by the way, prior to the pandemic, had been surging for 3 years. It was really alarming, the number of teenagers that were vaping marijuana and vaping nicotine. So the pandemic comes along, and there's a decline in their use. And we'll know in early next year, when the new national data comes out, we'll be able to see whether or not now the kids are back into their regular school pattern in schools. We'll be able to see if that decline in substance abuse that we saw among teenagers during the pandemic year, if it's rebounded and gone back up this year. But we'll have that data in early next year.
Yeah. So, Rick, we talked about this a little bit last time. Are you familiar with Dr. Anna Lemke out of Stanford and her book, Dopamine Nation?
I've heard about it, but I haven't read it.
Well, you probably don't need to, Rick. I mean, the subject matter expert over here. I definitely had to get a firm grasp on this. I absolutely loved that book. It opened my mind in such an empathetic way. I think, not that I was totally apathetic beforehand to anyone that was, dealing with substance abuse, but just having just a better understanding of how slippery that slope is and how easy it is to get addicted to just about anything, And for me, as I was reading that book, she poses the question, hey, you are not without a drug of choice. So tell me, Mr. Book Reader, what is your drug of choice? And you know what? I think when you ask yourself that, it comes to mind usually pretty quick. For me, honestly, it was video games. Not that video games had really caused any major issues in my life, but I was noticing that, like, if I was anxious, stressed, anything like that, hey, video games. That'll pick me right back up, right? The dopamine I get. And so I decided to do a bit of a dopamine fast. Went 3 weeks without video games. First week was incredibly difficult. Second week, a little bit easier. But then that third week, I felt like I had so much more clarity. And then as I went back into it, and I've tried to maintain this as best as I can, have tried to view it. My wife and I only started drinking alcohol in our 20s. Okay, we had been brought up pretty religiously that it was just not something we should ever do. But as we kind of stepped away from that religion, we made rules with each other, and we've held ourselves to this tremendously well. If you're sad, if you're depressed, if you're angry, if you're anything other than happy and okay, you're not allowed to drink. And we've maintained that. And I've noticed that as I've come back to playing video games, I've tried to have that mentality, and it actually makes the experience that much better because I'm no longer using my substance to get back to normal. I'm actually just, hey, it's already been a good day. We'll make it even better, right? Time to hang out, talk online with my buddies. And that's a long way of getting to is the dopamine fast. Video games is one thing, right? A hard substance, totally freaking different. It's a different field. But when you have a teenager that's coming in and you've kind of gone through the therapy side of it and are finally getting to the point where it's like, okay, now we can start treating this substance addiction. What have you found is the strategy, not only from your perspective as a therapist, but what do parents have to do to help their children break free from that addiction as well, from that abuse?
Well, the first thing I think is just to have a basic understanding of the neuroscience behind substance abuse. And I put a chapter in my book that explains how dopamine works in the brain. And the real important message for parents is the fact that their child's brain is in the process of developing. Our brains don't get developed fully until we're around age 24 or 25. So it's really important that parents understand that their child's brain is in the process of maturing and developing and forming those critical connections that child will need in adulthood.
Rick, I got to challenge you there, though. I'm 26, and my wife tells me that my brain is far from developed. So
well, you might be a little bit delayed, Andrew. She might be right because she's observing certain behaviors.
Yes, oh, she most certainly is. Sorry.
So you might be a little bit behind the curve here.
Probably.
You may need until maybe a few more years.
I think I do.
She'll let you know when she thinks your brain is matured, though. but I think it's important that parents understand that these substances can interact within a developing brain and really cause some difficulties that are not observable. And the example I would give you is that these kids that I worked with that were smoking a lot of marijuana, these were all very bright kids. Their IQs were average to above average to superior. They were very bright kids, but they were
really,
but they were, yeah, but they were smoking a lot of marijuana. But when the psychological reports came back, the psychological testing came back, what I noticed was the processing speed of their brain was below average. Their short-term memory was impaired, and their motivation was below average. Now, these are things that are not maybe readily observable, but it might explain why the child is struggling in school because their short-term memory isn't as sharp as they want it to be, and the processing speed of their brain, the brain's just not clicking along the way it should be. These are some of the effects that marijuana has on a developing brain. So parents just need to know that it's important that they do everything they can to protect that child's brain.
Can I ask, is that a cause or is that an effect? Is that the chicken or the egg there? Do we know?
That's an effect. That's the effect.
Okay, that's the effect.
Of putting a substance into a developing brain that shouldn't be.
Just curious, just because I hear that and I think, well, I mean, just because I like to play devil's advocate and think about all the angles, like what if just really smart kids who are just a little bit less motivated than most are more, what would be the right word, susceptible to substance abuse? Just curious, but no, it's an effect. Okay.
Well, the question always comes in, why do some people become addicted to a substance and other people don't? And we draw the distinction because addiction is not really a diagnosis.
It's a spectrum.
Anymore. It's a spectrum of substance abuse disorder that can be mild, moderate, or severe. Well, severe is more likely to be what addiction used to be called. But why do some people get captured by substances and others don't? Well, research shows that 40 to 60% of a person's vulnerability is purely genetics. And that's true of any disease. If you have hypertension in your family, what does it mean? You're more at risk for hypertension. If you're a woman and you have breast cancer in your family, what does it mean? It means you're more at risk. Doesn't mean you're going to get the disease, just means you're more at risk. The same is true for addiction. If you have addiction in your family, in your history, you're more at risk. So 40 to 60% is genetics. What's the remaining percentage? The remaining percentage is environmental factors. you know, and those often are what tips a person over the edge and gets them into the substance abuse issue. It's those environmental factors, high levels of stress, levels of abuse, all of the psychological issues, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, all of those can come into play, which pushes a person beyond the genetics into actually beginning to use a substance. Once they begin to use it, oftentimes it spirals and gets out of control.
Hmm. What kind of, um, you know, like there's no need ever to vilify really any of these substances, right? Like it makes sense why someone would turn to marijuana, alcohol, more hard drugs, and it's to cope with their anxiety and depression. Like that makes all the sense in the world. What resources do you think these teenagers, youth? I mean, this is not just a youth problem, but that's just your area of expertise. And so, like, what resources are we not providing? Like, what are the other options that they could pick that we're not doing a good enough job as a society of giving them that resource, teaching them that resource is there, whether that's a mental skill, a habit, more counselors in school. What are those resources that we need to be giving these kids to keep them from turning to substances?
Well, we live in an age where, we want instant gratification. And kids are no different than adults. They want instant gratification for their anxiety. They want instant relief from their depression. They want instant relief from any type of emotion or thought or memory that's disturbing to them. And we just are not built to be able to use some of the skills that we know would work, that require like meditation, cognitive reframing, all of these skills that require a lot of practice, but we know that they work and they take time. We're just not built to want to do those. We want relief right now, and kids are no different. They want relief right now.
Is
So
that an evolutionary thing?
I think it's always been there. I mean, nobody likes to feel pain. Nobody likes to have, disturbing thoughts or emotions or memories that upset us. We want to run away from them. We want to get away from them. And I think that's normal. The problem is that we're not willing to take the time to learn the skills to deal with those issues in a more healthy way, because they take time, they take practice. We want instant gratification. Well, how do you get instant gratification? Comes through a drug. Maybe it's a prescribed drug. Maybe it's a street drug. Um, but you ask an important question. What are we doing wrong when it comes to these kids? Well, what we're doing wrong is we're not educating them. You know, we're still dragging them
Yeah.
into assemblies at
Come on,
school.
Rick, just
And
say no is super effective, right?
yeah, right. Yeah, just say no. Yeah, works good for sex too,
Yeah,
right?
oh
Just say
yeah.
no. Yeah, that crap never worked in the first
Yep.
place. It's
The
not
only
working
form of
today.
safe sex is abstinence, right?
Yeah,
The only
right.
form.
So when I was working with these teenagers, it didn't do me any good to tell them the drug was illegal. It didn't do me any good to tell them that if they continue to use, their grades might drop, they might not graduate, they might not get into college, they might not get a job. They didn't care because they didn't believe any of that stuff. But what did capture their attention? It was the neuroscience. When I started to talk to them about their brain, and I started to educate them about the vulnerability in the brain, that they were interested in, that captured their attention. So I would show them a picture of a brain. I show them what the different areas of the brain do. You have an area of the brain that helps you talk. You have an area of the brain that helps you walk. You have an area of the brain that helps you process information. Then I showed them that same picture of the brain and where marijuana attaches itself to in the brain. And that caught their attention, because that showed them what marijuana does in their brain. And I have a picture of that in my book. But what I'm getting at is, if you want to get to these kids, Lecturing them about the legal aspects is not going to work. Talk to them about the neuroscience, educate them about the neuroscience, and then help them to understand how these drugs work in the brain and the importance of protecting the brain. They're more likely to be interested in that than if you give them a lecture about how they're going to go to jail.
That's just so interesting. And something I actually really relate to as well. I feel like over the years that I've read books and everything, and just for example, one of the first books that really hit me was the book. It was a book called Grit by Angela Duckworth. She just really talks about how just really the only consistent measurement of success really ever was consistency in the face of everything. And that story really became even more impactful for me when I learned about, for example, how neural pathways in the brain form and how, the circuitry in our brain, the more you use a certain neural path, the more myelination happens. And how myelination, that mylar sheath, or myelin sheath around your circuitry actually allows for electricity to flow easier. And like the electricity is just like us, we're going to go where there's least resistance. So it's just super interesting. And I only came into that during really adulthood, but if someone had brought that to me as a teenager, gosh, I do think I would have just eaten that up. How do they usually respond to that?
They respond very favorably when I was working with them. Like I was saying, it didn't do me any good to tell them this stuff was illegal or bad for them. They didn't care to listen to that. But they were interested in their brain. They were interested in how their brain works, and they were interested in how these drugs work within the brain. And you could almost see, their interest peak up. And because they were learning things that they didn't know about the brain, and they were learning what drugs do to the brain. And that caught their attention. And some of them actually started to reconsider whether or not they wanted to continue using the substance. Some of them would say, okay, I'm going to get off of this stuff for 6 months and see how things go. Some of them said I'd get off for a little while, but at least it got them to the point of beginning to think, what is this stuff doing to me that I don't know about? What's going on in my brain? And maybe I should really reconsider what I'm doing here. And that's the best you can do, to tap into their thoughts, and to get them to be curious about what's going on, because that's the first step, I think, to moving them away from substance use. Get them curious about what these drugs are doing to their brain.
How do we help these kids? So let's assume that someone successfully comes off of a heavy marijuana use, right? The additional anxiety brought on by abusing a substance has faded, but they're then back to the regular anxiety of life. From that point, how do we? I mean, this is the question of the ages, right? How to deal with anxiety, how to decrease it. But maybe specifically for our youth in high school right now, once we're off these drugs, how do we then go and deal with normal life again?
Well, that's the key question. When you have a child that's dually diagnosed, and unfortunately, when we come across a child that's using a substance, we focus on the substance. Okay, and oftentimes what goes undiagnosed is the underlying issue that's causing the substance use. So we focus on the kid using the marijuana, but we don't ask, well, why is he using marijuana? Or we don't do the testing to uncover if there is a psychological issue that child is struggling with. So and that's the importance of getting adequate testing done that I talk about in my book. You want, as a parent, to be able to rule in or rule out whether or not there's these other psychological issues going on, because if they're there, if those are the issues, they need to be treated. It doesn't do me any good to treat the kid's marijuana use and not do anything to help him with his anxiety. You have to treat both if they're there. And unfortunately, many times these underlying issues that the child is medicating often go undiagnosed and untreated.
Yeah, I mean that's super important. I think again referencing Dopamine Nation, that was something that also really helped me to gain that empathy. Is to look, I think it's pretty easy to look at someone, on the street that's addicted, clearly like on something, avid drug user, and think, kind of almost look down on them. But to really dive in and be like, no, there's a freaking reason this person is here. Like, gosh, that sucks. Um, you end up just wanting to help them, which I think is what spreading this kind of information does. If we can really dive in and just say, hey, oh man, I think it's probably easier for for some type of people to be like, oh, these freaking kids, like they're just bored and like life's so easy. What the hell are they complaining about? But to your point, like they're not built for what they're going through. And when we reference that, I don't want to speak for you, Rick, so please correct me if you're not, but I think you're speaking to, like, for possibly millions and millions of years, humans have lived a certain way. And we've adapted to that certain way, and we are now living in the exact polar opposite. We're really taking a square peg into a round hole. Like our brains just aren't built for what we're going through nowadays. So, like, how do you help these kids, either become a circle peg, or how do you get them to make the circle hole into a square peg? Like, what do we need to do there?
Well, I think as parents, we just need to be aware of what's going on with our kids, and we all have busy lives and sometimes they slip through. Um, but the reason I wrote my book was to give parents the information, the basic information, so that they knew what the warning signs were. They knew if they needed to get some tests, what tests should they get done, what are the treatment options that are available, what questions should they ask a treatment provider. I wanted parents to feel more confident and less paranoid about this subject, which can be very scary for parents. Thinking that your child might someday get addicted to a drug, that's very scary for a parent. And unfortunately, that fear often drives them away from having the information that they need to stay on top of that issue. So that was the goal in writing the book, to help parents feel more secure, more confident, and be able to feel like, if I have to deal with this, I know what to do.
I mean, obviously people should buy your book. I'm going to buy your book. So let's not give away absolutely everything, but I'd love to hear, just because I'm super interested, what are some of like are there any things that parents do that are like initially well intentioned but end up hurting the child long term?
I think one example is, and this happens in some families, where they will say to their child, I don't care if you drink alcohol, but you have to do it in our home. I don't want you drinking anywhere else. You can drink here. And you could apply that to marijuana or whatever you want. The research shows that in families where they take the attitude that you can drink here in the house, but I don't want you drinking outside, that those kids actually end up drinking more when they leave the home than kids who come from families where it was just totally discouraged, no drinking at all. So that permissive attitude of you can drink here in our home backfires on them eventually, and kids go off and they go off to school or they go off to work. They end up drinking more than kids that came from an environment where it was absolutely not allowed at all.
That is super interesting. I would have always thought that that's like an okay strategy. Just like introduce and like teach them how they can handle it and everything. But no, you're like, the research is pretty clear. That's just the wrong strategy. What is a good strategy for a parent then? Because the reason I would think the previous one works is like, teach a kid to never shoot a gun and they're gonna go join the army, kind of thing, right? I would think that, not treating these substances as so taboo that that they become alluring is a good strategy. So, what is the good strategy for introduction and teaching kids to respect instead of to either overuse or totally neglect these substances, if that makes sense?
Well, I think it gets back to the neuroscience. I would suggest that if you have a child that's preteen, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, that during those ages you start to teach the child about the brain. Teach them what the brain is, teach them what the brain does, teach them about the different areas of the brain and what they do, help them understand the importance of the brain. And then as they move into middle school and high school, then you can start to educate them about what drugs do to the brain. First teach them about the brain in elementary school, and then in middle school and high school start to introduce how these drugs work in the brain. And I think if that's done and reinforced every year, it certainly would hopefully cut down the likelihood that that child is going to experiment with any drugs, because they have a better understanding of how these drugs work in the brain.
Okay. Rick, can you please plug your book so people can go find it, and then also plug any other kind of resources that, if a parent's listening to this, a teenager's listening to this, that they can go look at your work and get some more information from you?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I would encourage anyone that's interested to go to the book's website, which is www.helptheaddictedchild.com.
And we'll link that below as well.
And so helptheaddictedchild.com. When you get to the site, you'll be able to read endorsements for the book. You'll be able to read reviews. You'll be able to see a sample chapter. There's a link that will take you to Amazon where you can purchase the book. It's available as a Kindle, and it's also available as a paperback. I think the paperback is the better version, because it's something that if you're a young parent or your child is young, you might want to read it to get the basic information, put it on the bookshelf, and maybe refer to it every once in a while. Or you may have a family or a friend that might need some help, and you can loan it out to them. So the book is available on Amazon. I kept it to about 100 pages because I know that parents are busy. They don't have time to read volumes of information on this. So I wanted it to be something that a parent could read very quickly, but walk away with the idea, okay, I've got this. I understand it better now. I'm less afraid. I think I can handle this. I hope I don't have to, but I think I can. And that's the purpose of the book. And so if people are interested, go to the website, and it'll take you to Amazon.
Love that. Okay, Rick Capriola, thank you for your time. I appreciate you. I think in this conversation, I think we're definitely becoming more aware that this is a problem that we can tackle, but that it's a real problem. It's a real thing. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate you inviting me to the program and for your participation in the discussion, which I think helped add value to it. So thank you so much for inviting me and hosting this discussion.
Appreciate it.